Hello, my name is Clarissa Walker, and I am the instructor for Writing 303, and this is the Research Slides session number 1. In session number 1, we will be talking about several things. First, I want to bring your attention to the MLA citation slide that will be a part of all of the slide series. This is just telling you how to cite the actual PowerPoint presentation. The scholars and the research, the journal articles that we are referring to, those are listed in the syllabus for Writing 303. It's listed under additional materials in MLA style, but this citation is for material that's coming from the actual slide presentation. For today's lesson, these are the key points, the main concepts that we will be grappling with today. Here is the most important place to start. What is for a course that's called Public Writing, and of course we are also discussing public rhetoric, we offer this definition to work with to begin with. So public rhetoric and writing, it's the content, speeches, images, because we also deal with visual rhetoric in this course, speeches, images, video, or written artifacts that are circulated and engaged by a self-selected audience. That is very, very important to consider the taxonomy of that definition, because we are talking about written words, public writing. We are considering the written, but we're also talking about the spoken, the utterances in this course as well. We're talking about things that are circulating not only as in the social media circulation or going viral, but we're talking about things that circulate and move through time, generational movement in this course. And finally, the self-selected audience is an important difference if you are a scholar of composition and rhetoric, because often we talk about audiences as intended audiences, as though there is a rhetor or a creator of rhetoric who is targeting a particular audience. This is a different perspective on that conceptualization. This is talking about people who are selecting themselves to be the audience or the public for a particular artifact. These are the concepts that we will grapple with for the whole semester. So, public rhetoric and writing, it's the content. Speeches, it includes the content. That's in speeches, images, video, written artifacts that are circulated around virally, but also through time and engaged by a self-selected audience. Now, for this particular set of research slides, we're focusing on two particular scholars. One is C. David Listman, and C. David Listman will give us the opportunity to touch on some of the civic malaise and civic literacy discussions that often become a part of public writing discussions. So, civic malaise is defined here as the problematic tendency of thinking too much about self and not enough about community or world issues. So civic malaise is that feeling of alienation, not feeling like a world citizen, and it's relevant for us because when civic malaise is in place, there is no real interest in compelling change, which is the ultimate goal of public writing. So public writing and public rhetoric, ultimately, they are credited with inspiring or causing change rather than being directly, or whether it's direct change or indirectly. Public rhetoric and public writing inspires or causes change. Public rhetoric and public writing inspires or eventually causes change. So civic malaise is obviously the opposite of that, because if someone is saying, I have civic malaise, or if civic malaise is the condition of a particular group of people or a particular generation of people, that means that they are not interested in change, being a part of change, being a catalyst for change, but they are centered on self, not world issues, and don't consider themselves or operate from a place of world citizenry. I'm not a world citizen. I am concerned with myself. So civic malaise is too much thinking of self and not enough thinking about community or world issues. And that is relevant for us because we are concerned with, in this course, writing and rhetoric that causes change, initiates change, is a catalyst for change, whether that be intentionally created for that purpose or creates it anyway. That is what we are looking at this semester. So civic literacy, Listman gives us that discussion as well. Civic literacy refers to someone who knows how, when they have it, when they have the desire to cause change. Civic literacy means that they know how to go about doing that. They know how to participate in public rhetoric. They know how to participate in public writing to cause the change that they want to see. That's civic literacy. So knowing how to participate and cause change in your community and greater society. So Listman has this wonderful quote that we will talk a little bit about. And he talks about, with respect to the urgent social concern, whether it be drugs, any urgent social concern, drugs, crime, unemployment, racism, family breakdowns, those are the types of things that we like to deal with, especially if we are into activism and overt activism. It is important that these problems be understood in terms of their root causes. So Listman is suggesting something that may be a little bit obvious to some of us, but he reminds us that when it comes to civic literacy, part of that conversation is about knowing how to spring into action or move into the public sphere and cause change, but doing so from the root cause. It is considered, it is a foundation by which a democratic society functions, according to Listman. So it's not only going out and doing something. Civic literacy is not just about activity, because sometimes the appearance of busyness, we call it activism. But civic literacy means knowing how to isolate, identify the root cause of these social ills or social ailments or social concerns, and addressing them and knowing how to respond to the root cause. So that is a part of the definition of civic literacy. Now, we're moving on to Michael Warner, and he's kind of the central scholar for this particular lesson. So Michael Warner, in a book called Publics and Counterpublics, this is the proper MLA citation for it, and you can also find that in the syllabus. We'll talk about some of his conceptualizations of the things and the elements of our course theory and research. So a public, we were talking earlier about conceptualizations of audience and how we think about an audience as an intended or targeted group in some scholarship. Michael Warner talks about a public in a different way. It's a self-selecting and self-understanding group of participants who choose to engage with specific rhetoric, not to be confused with the public. So sometimes people talk about they're addressing the public, or they are talking very generally about a fictitious social totality. They have like in their minds this very general group of people and they call it the public. That is not what Michael Warner's talking about. He is talking about a very specific group of people who have decided for themselves that they are participating in to engage. They've made the decision to engage in a particular artifact or particular rhetoric. And we're going to talk more about that right now. Okay, the example that I use to explain this, and I don't know how many of you would reach back far enough into the 70s and know anything about the Rocky Horror Picture Show. But this is definitely a cult classic. No matter how you feel about it, if you think it's garbage or if you think it's great, the Rocky Horror Picture Show had a very specific public, right? So public engagement, in this case, Rocky Horror Picture Show fans, they went to see this movie in cinemas that often showed it at midnight. They would often go 10, 15, 20 times. The public for this particular rhetoric, for this particular script, for this particular show, this content, they would go and brag about having seen it 100 times or 50 times, right? So there are multiple viewings. They engaged with this multiple times. It had its own language, obviously, and it's a written script. So they memorized the script and would talk to the screen. So part of it was a call and response of the public. So they memorized the script and knew when to speak back to the screen. So if you've ever gone to one of these, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you have never been, it probably sounds really weird. But they were a part of the public because they engaged this rhetoric in this way. They made the decision to go, they made the decision to participate, and they made the decision to engage. It's a visual rhetoric. Not only included the visuals of the movie or the film, but the public that followed the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which is one of the reasons I chose this one as an example, they actually dress up like the characters in the movie when they go to view the movie. So that's high engagement. But I chose it because it's such an obvious example of engagement. So when a public chooses to engage with rhetoric or a particular artifact, they are self-selecting. They understand themselves to be the fandom of Rocky Horror Picture Show because they self-identify as such. They picked themselves. Now, the creators of the Rocky Horror Picture Show, they didn't identify this audience. This audience in the way that Michael Warner teaches us about public. These are self-selecting, self-understanding people who made the decision to engage the rhetoric of this particular artifact. And the engagement was in multiple viewings. They memorized the script and they participated in the visual rhetoric of this particular film by also dressing up, putting it on them. They embodied it. So I thought that was a great example because it's so obvious. Another example is with the sororities. This is Alpha Kappa Alpha and Pike. But basically, this is another group. So this is the shield and the Greek letters. So this is also the mission. All of those things are examples of decisions to engage with this rhetoric. So public engagement here is these are self-selecting participants to the extent, because we all know that there's a process and an intake process and and in some cases hazing or whatever. But before all of that, for the mixers and whatever, there's a decision on this audience to participate. So they're self-selecting in that sense. They understand themselves to be interested in this rhetoric. And then the rhetoric that is engaged with these Greek organizations is the shield, is the creed or the mission of the organization, right? And there are multiple throughout their organization. There are multiple examples of things that are the rhetoric of the organization that is engaged by a very specific public. So the members are the public of this rhetoric. Warner says, to address a public or to think of oneself as belonging to a public is to be a certain kind of person. You inhabit that social world. To have at one's disposal certain media and genres, to be motivated by a certain normative horizon, and to speak within a certain language ideology. Now, in both of those instances, with the Rocky Horror Picture Show and Pi Kappa Alpha, Alpha Kappa Alpha, the Greek organizations, all of those things are true. Obviously, with politics, that is also true. I'm intentionally staying away from the political examples because those are the more obvious examples that we are constantly engaging with and constantly using. But it's not, sometimes this is apolitical, and I think we miss those lessons in the apolitical areas where we are not discussing publics who self-select, self-understand themselves to be the public of a particular rhetoric, right? Identifying themselves as the public, claiming themselves, self-identifying, but claiming themselves to be the public of a particular rhetoric, right? And so he's adding to that, they have to, this public, have access, right, at one's disposal, right? So in a sense, there's a privilege to access that must be in place to be a part of the public for a particular rhetoric. And finally, of course, language and ideology, which we talked about, of course, Greek organizations, and in the Rocky Horror Picture Show case, there's a language associated with that particular rhetoric that is engaged by its public. Publics do not exist apart from the discourse that addresses them, according to Warner. So this is a very specific piece of his claim, and it makes a lot of sense to many scholars. Warner's a leader in this theory, but publics do not exist apart from the discourse that addresses them. So if you think about Greek organizations, they exist because of the rhetoric. They exist because of the structure, the rhetorical activity that had to take place to create this structure. They exist because of that, right? So the publics exist because of that discourse. If you think about Rocky Horror Picture Show, obviously it is that film and the rhetoric that is in that script that created the opportunity for this public to exist. Publics do not exist apart from the discourse that addresses them, is what Warner is saying. And that's just repeating what I just said. Discourse addressing the Rocky Horror fans, the AKA sorors, and of course Democrats and Republicans is another. Independents is a more common example. The Democratic platform or the Republican platform, and of course all of the things that they stand for are how people self-select and self-understand themselves to be a part of a political party. So that is how a public self-selects and chooses to be a part of the following for a rhetoric, Warner says, no single text can create a public. A public is understood to be an ongoing space of encounter for discourse. Not the texts themselves create the public, but the concatenations of text through time. Now that is important because we are talking about generational influence and how every single thing in the ecology, every human and non-human thing, has an impact on the rhetoric that we're talking about. So they're simply saying that the film is, Rocky Horror Picture Show didn't stop in 1975 when it was actually produced. Since its production, it has encountered generations, and the public, a film's public has had all kinds of interpretations and re-envisionings, and every time the costume is re-envisioned and changed, and every time something is added, because in 1975 what we thought in terms of a public space or an entertainment space, in censorship, etc., was totally different. So more recent generations will add a different perspective to that, a purview. And then AKA is the same thing. AKA, the sorority, was started in 1908. So there have been so many sorors, generations of sorors. When they began, there were so many different, vastly different ideas about womanhood. The organization, the mission, the rhetoric exists still, but what has changed and what has been adjusted has been added through the encounters, and the re-envisioning and the transformation of the rhetoric that happened over time. So that's what this is talking about. It's not saying that the mission of the organization, the Greek organization itself, on paper, that paragraph created the public. That's not what creates the public. It's the encounters with the texts over time. Multiple encounters have to be considered, according to Michael Warner. Obviously, the Democratic Party is another example, which was said to start in 1828. Obviously, today, it still exists, but in a totally different form. If you're a political science major, you know and know that that's a very trackable thing, the evolution and the changes that these political parties have gone through, and what compelled these changes, the events and the people that compelled change. The platform and the rhetoric of it may have been the same, but how they have been interpreted, re-envisioned, and used have been different. So again, this is just to reiterate, Michael Warner, gives us this idea that publics are self-selecting, self-understanding. They possess multiple histories, and that's very easy to conceptualize, because if you think about a Rocky Horror Picture Show theater filled with 200 people, there are 200 different histories sitting in those seats, different age groups, different experiences, maybe even from different regions, right? So there are multiple histories within a public. And then there are multiple versions through time. So the women who are in Alpha Kappa Alpha in 2018 and 2019 are very different than the women who were in Alpha Kappa Alpha in 1908, is what Michael Warner is telling us. The mission and the rhetoric has remained the same, but it has been affected by the encounters through time, through the multiple histories, by this self-selecting and self-understanding public. So that's the last slide for this particular session. Research slides number 1 concludes here. Have a good afternoon.